Welcome to 44 and 1. I'm GVizzle, this is Tempest, and today we are talking about...
Apologies. And I have to apologize for interrupting you and having to do that intro 3 times.
Apology accepted, which, according to the Ontario Act of Canada, is not an admission of guilt. All of Canada, except for the Yukon, has an Apology Act, and it is a law that provides apologies made by a person does not necessarily constitute an admission of guilt. In 2009, an act was passed which made apologies inadmissible in court. So saying sorry meant an expression of sympathy or regret, not an admission of fault or liability in connection with the matter to which the words or actions relate. That's how much Canadians apologize, that we had to put a whole law around sorry doesn't actually mean I'm sorry.
Sorry.
It doesn't mean I did that to you. It just means I'm sorry that was done to you.
Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yes. I don't blame you for being upset.
Yeah.
And you said the UK is about to enact something similar.
Yeah, they've been trying to for a while. It's on its second reading in the House of Commons. So I don't know if you have the same process as us, since your system's like based on ours, but we have the House of Commons first, where all the MPs are. Then they do like a first reading, a second reading, then they have a committee and they do a report, then they have a third reading, and then eventually go to the House of Lords, where all of like the old white men are. There is women as well, but we just like to joke that they're old white men. And then they do the same process, and then it gets put into law, and it has to have a royal assent. The Queen has to agree.
So where is it in the current process?
The second reading in the House of Commons, and they've been at it since like 2017.
Oh,
yeah.
So it's going to take a while yet. It's taken 5 years to get to this level.
Yeah, basically. The Compensation Act 2006. So it's basically that if you apologize in something that's happened, like a car accident or whatever, so you're just saying it in the situation because we're British and we apologize for stuff, just like the Canadians. And it's just to mean that for the purposes of insurance, they're not able to make you liable for it just because you said sorry.
And that's the same here, is that just because you've said you're sorry doesn't mean you were saying it was my fault. It was just sorry, which I guess is an interesting distinction, because I never would have thought of it, like until I read the act, I never would have thought of it as an admission of guilt, unless it was like depending on the context, right? Like if I tripped you and then I said, I'm sorry, I tripped you by accident. If I did it on purpose, I'm not sorry. But if I tripped you by accident and I said, I'm sorry, then yes, I am sorry that I tripped you. But if I saw you trip, like, sorry, are you okay? I'm like, and I think that's how I would start the sentence. I didn't even do anything, and I'm apologizing. Sorry, are you okay? Sorry to interrupt you mid-fall, but are you doing?
Yeah. And it's kind of like in Britain, we say sorry before anything, like just a normal conversation, and you'd be like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Can you just get that for me?" Or "I'm sorry. Can you explain this to me?"
But that doesn't mean anything anymore. Like when it's used in such casual context, does the word even mean anything?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because like you'd almost think like when you had to make a real apology, sorry wouldn't cut it anymore because you say sorry all the time. You'd have to be like, my deepest regrets.
Which brings me on to the Germans. So they say "Es tut mir leid," which is "it does me sorrow." And then that's when it's a heartfelt apology. They do have a shorter version for it, and I don't know what that word is. But because in German and English, we construct our sentences very differently, and there's very different kind of cultural connotations of how we say stuff. So I was at a train station, I think it was in Frankfurt, and I didn't know where to go or what to do. And then I saw like this woman was sitting behind a help desk. So I was like, okay, I'll go speak to that person. My speaking German is very bad. It's not as good as my reading. And so I just thought, okay, so I've got to go up to her and I've got to say, I'm sorry, do you speak English? And then, and I went, "Es tut mir leid, sprechen Sie English?" And she went, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you, don't worry." Yes, I can speak English.
So what she was hearing was, "It does me sorrow."
Yeah.
Do you speak English?
Yeah. So like...
But why would she have been like, I don't understand why she would have been like, "Oh no, I'm fine." Like how?
I know she was mocking it because she could tell that I was being English. So she was mocking English politeness.
I always kind of thought Canadian politeness was a myth. Maybe it's growing up here. Like I always hear those jokes about like Americans will say that Canada is so polite and we say oot and a boot, which we don't. But I guess maybe it's because I grew up in it. I don't notice if we're more or less polite than the average person. I don't know.
I think if you compare it to general American culture and you compare it to general European or British culture, I don't think the Canadians are especially polite. I just think Canadians are, on the whole, I mean, obviously you're a very diverse culture, but on the whole, you're quite just pleasant people. Like, you know, you don't impose on other people and you're not in their face. But then American culture in general, again, but in general, they could be a bit more brash and louder by our standards as Brits. So, so maybe from like the American perspective, with the way that they express themselves is just like Canadians are more like British people. And then so to Americans, you just seem like really overly polite and well-mannered when really you're just like British people.
Okay.
That's just my perspective. It's an
interesting perspective. And I wonder how much like movies and television shape it, because like when I watch movies and television, right, and someone like answers the phone, like it's always so curt and like no one ever says goodbye, no one does any of that stuff. And I know it's for like, because I actually saw something recently that said it's done intentionally because of the flow and pacing of the show, right? That it would just be weird if it was like, all right, okay, bye, or so they just take it out. But I guess when, like, I wonder how prevalent that is, and that like, because if you grew up watching television where no one says goodbye and no one says, you know, like the niceties of stuff, then do you adopt that or just assume that that's the way that it is? So if you hear like maybe Canadian television is written a little bit differently, where I don't know if we add the goodbyes into TV shows. I've never paid attention, but like maybe just like hearing what you're expected to see in culture. Like I grew up believing, and I don't know if this is true or not, that like everyone in the US wears their shoes in the house, because on TV and movies, they just come in and leave the shoes in the house. It's like, how do you live like that?
Yeah. You have to take your shoes off.
Yeah. Why are you doing that?
Yeah, exactly. Man, when I was a kid, if I wore my shoes in the house, life wouldn't be worth living.
What?
I've had a very short existence.
Oh, my mom, we used to always have to take ours off in the entranceway of our house, and it was like a narrow hallway. So like there were 5 of us in the house, so there was lots of shoes. And like if my mom has a short fuse, so like if she would get home one day and try to open the front door and like a shoe got in her way, like one day she just grabbed it was like a snowy day, she grabbed all the shoes and just like threw them out the door.
Amazing.
And it was just, and then afterwards she was like, go get your shoes.
Because of our culture and our identity growing up, you know, I spent half my life growing up in Wales. I spent the other half growing up in England. And then you have quite, I guess, like strong surroundings of Portuguese because of your parents. But then they also chose to settle in Ontario, or in Toronto, but they could have gone anywhere else. And how much has that influenced our development? And how much of it... Go.
No, I was going to just pick it up and go from there, because I remember now, and then we don't have to do any editing there. I said, so my parents were born and raised in Portugal. They moved to Canada. So, I mean, I don't know that the discussion ever surrounded staying in Portugal. I don't know if that was on the table, but like I theoretically could have been born and raised in Portugal. They decided to come to Canada because my dad's brother was here, but he also had, I think, a cousin in Boston and a cousin in California. So those were also on the table. So I've often like my sister and I, seeing things that have been happening in the US over the past couple of years, my sister and I will occasionally like thank my mom for deciding to come to Canada. But then it also raises the question, if we had stayed in Portugal, what would our personalities and life be like if we came to Canada? So we know who we are in Canada. Would that have been different if we were Boston or the US? Would we be the same people just with like a Boston accent? Or would the surrounding culture and the politics and the socioeconomic situation that we would be in and the education, so like would all of that have factored in to fundamentally change our personalities and who we are? So how much of us is nature versus nurture?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Because I don't think we know definitively out on an individual level how much of you is kind of transferable across different outcomes.
You grew up in Wales and then you grew up in London. I wonder if those were reversed. If you started in England and then you moved to Wales, would that have factored in any differently? Or are those cultures similar enough, different enough? Like, I don't know a lot, pardon my ignorance, apologizing again, pardon my ignorance, but are the cultures different enough that you could have fundamentally been a different person?
This is the thing that I think about a lot, actually, is what I can't figure out is how much of my personality is growing up in is Welsh, and how much of it is English, how much of it is autistic, how much is it academic, and all those other things that have kind of, I guess, put pressure on me through my development to create who I am now.
And also a dysfunctional family.
Yeah, exactly.
That would have a huge, I mean, that's definitely nurture, not nature, but that would also play a part of it.
Well, you say it's definitely nurture, not nature, but the dysfunctionality in the family could be due to genetic things that are creating certain behaviors in the family that are interacting with the culture of the family, and they play against each other.
This is where I kind of question that, because like my dad had 5 or 6 siblings. I can't remember now, but I think there were 6 of them in total. And they all, I mean, you would think that they would all share very similar traits. If it was nurture or nature, that they would all, coming from the same people, they would all be very similar, but they're all very different. Like my grandfather was abusive, my dad was abusive, but none of his brothers are, or if they were, it was in different ways, right? Maybe verbal, maybe something else, but like they all were raised they're all around the same age, like the age gap isn't that big, so they were all brought up by the same parents, the same circumstance, but they all fundamentally responded differently.
But there's not going to be the same circumstances for each child, though, because the very fact that they're different people as individuals means that they're going to have different microenvironments compared to their siblings. So,
yes, but fundamentally they're all.
But not necessarily, though. Like, because me and my sister, for example, we have like a big age gap, 9 years apart, and her upbringing was not anywhere near as traumatizing as mine.
I wonder how much of that has to do with age gap, though. Like, 9 years is a lot of time for your mom to have mellowed out, or right? And also, like, male, female. Like my brother got away with a lot more stuff than my sister and I did, just by the sheer fact that he was a boy. And
but this is kind of what. But this is what I'm kind of saying. Like the even though the differences aren't that apparent as a gender difference or an age difference, there is still going to be individual differences between each of the siblings. And also when children are created, because life begins at conception now, apparently, according to people in government.
Governments.
Yeah. Jokes aside, it takes DNA from half of one parent and half from the other parent, and it mixes them. But it doesn't mean that DNA that is being mixed is the same in every single sperm and every single ovary.
True.
It's just because it's just there's a lot of statistical chance at play. So whether you're going to get the dominant gene or the recessive gene, it's all a roll of the dice. And then your genetics are so complicated that there's going to be so many interrelations between all these things that it's very hard to tell which is actually how much of a percentage is due to nature and how much of a percentage is due to nurture. You might have a high genetic predisposition for, say, alcoholism, but if you have like no pressures in your environment, you might never develop alcoholism. Or you could have like almost no genetic predisposition to alcoholism, but high environmental pressure to develop it, and you still might never develop alcoholism. So
what side of the nature versus nurture are you saying? It's kind of 50-50?
It's both. I'm not saying it's 50-50. I think it depends on individual differences in environment and pressure and all that stuff. And I think for every single person, it's going to be different. But it is a relationship between your genetic coding with your environment, and then those are co-created to they kind of mingle together to co-create you.
Okay, so then let's say my genetics would be the same, my upbringing would be the same, because it's the same people who made me, same ingredients that came together, same household, same dynamic. So that would all be the same. But me growing up in Portugal versus Canada versus Boston versus California, even though the upbringing would be the same, I may be a very, very different person depending on where I was. Would you want to know? Would you want, like, I'm Portugal raised GVizzle. Like, I'm curious about what it would be like to open that door, like the Midnight Library, that book, right? Where she was able to open up different doors in different lives. Like, I don't know if I would want to know.
Yeah, it's like sliding doors as well, like how your life could have gone and didn't, you know, like, and then because part of it is that I think because we're both quite happy with the way our lives have turned out, it's very hard, I think, for us to accept that it could have been different, even though like our lives at different points have been good or bad. And then certainly if when my life was shit, I probably would have been like, yeah, let's see how fucking different it could be. But now I'm kind of like, because I've reconciled my past, my history with who I am now, I kind of like who I am. And like, if I hadn't had all those horrible pressures, because there were good things as well, obviously, but like, if there wasn't those horrible pressures, I wouldn't have been able to appreciate the good stuff and I wouldn't be me. And then this person here wouldn't exist.
But what if you could peek in and like see that a different version of you is happier, like happier, smarter, richer, like just all if the other you is like, if you're looking at the movie Twins with Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger, you realize like, oh shit, I've been Danny DeVito this entire time. And I thought, there's the Schwarzenegger version of me. I've been DeVito thinking I was Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing I find actually, like, the other question I find just as interesting is how, even though we've had some similar experiences, how are we so similar? Like, our genetics aren't the same. Our upbringing had some similarities, but is very different. We're from different parts of, even though we're both Western, we're from different parts of the Western world. And
it's not like we could say like, oh, we were born, like, I was born in 74, you were 84. So it's not like we grew up with the same musical influences, cultural influences, like television, whatever, all that stuff. That would have been different too.
Although we both watched Thundercats and we both listened to. Sorry.
That's true. So maybe there is something to that. Maybe you have more Gen X sensibilities than
I do. Yeah.
Than you thought.
I think that because my age group, early 80s, we're on the cusp of Gen X to millennial. And then it's kind of like, depending on your parents, is whether you were going to be a Gen X or a millennial. And my upbringing was very much Gen X, just complete neglect.
I don't think that was Gen X. I think that was just kind of abuse. Like,
yeah.
Oh, hi there. Are you looking for a fun pair of glasses because you don't have your own personality? What? Well, hi there. Are you looking for some fun glasses to showcase your unique style and personality? That was better? That was a good one? Okay. Then you should go to zlul.com. Whether it's your personality or someone else's you want to show off, you'll find glasses at Zlul for incredibly low prices. And you can use my promo code to get even more of a save. GVizzle, save 8.
So my upbringing was Gen X, but not like neglect. You know, both parents working out of the house. So, and my brother and sister being 6 and 7 years older, 7 and 8, whatever years older than I am, right? Like when I got home after school, they were usually gone doing their own thing. My parents were still at work. My mom usually got home from work pretty early. So there was that. And my dad worked shift work. So either he was home or he wasn't home. And it was like 2 weeks night shift, 2 weeks day shift. So it wasn't neglect, but I was that kid who had like a spare key hanging in the garage. So if I forgot my key, I'd be able to like get the key, get into the house.
And this is the thing, is like all of these little experiences you get through your life interact with who you already are and then help you develop into a new version of yourself.
Yeah.
And all of these little things wouldn't have happened if anything in your life had been different, you would be at least like a little bit different compared to who you are now.
I mean, certainly growing up in Portugal, because I mean, it wasn't like a mainland Portugal. It's an island. in the Azores. So it's not as, I think even still today, and I could be wrong, so I know if I am wrong, I will be corrected for sure. Like, I think it's still not as modern as like the rest of Portugal will be. So like music would have been very different, especially growing up in the 70s and 80s. I would have been surrounded by Portuguese music, which I do enjoy, but like that would have been that, you know, cultural experience. I wouldn't perhaps have gone down the punk road or the heavy metal road, because I would have been exposed to the music that would be available to me, and being on a small island, it would have been pretty limited.
And then there's all of the I guess the undertones of things like punk and metal, like all the philosophies or ideologies hidden within it, and all the messages in the music. And you wouldn't have had like a female icon like that Doro. You know, you wouldn't have been exposed to something like that. And that
no, it would have been Maria Freira.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just kind of like that, just like a little experience like that just shows you how different things could be if you just don't have that icon to look up to.
Yeah, and I mean, up until then, had we been in Boston or California, Doro was, I'm pretty sure, Swedish or German, I don't know, but like I wouldn't have, like, up until then, a lot of the women that I had seen in music had been Canadian, right? Like Lee Aaron, she was kind of like, Lita Ford is American, but Lee Aaron was Canadian, but I wouldn't have had exposure to Lee Aaron being in the US because she never really kind of made it big, as big south of the border. So I wouldn't have heard her there. Like I would have been exposed to a whole other different musical culture. And then even like TV would have been different, and like everything would have been different versus like, I grew up watching Degrassi Junior High, which was a show about like, you know, it actually followed many generations of kids on Degrassi Street, which is a street in Toronto. So it was a very Canadian show. Well, I don't know what I would have grown up with in the US. Like it would have been that, probably Saved by the Bell, which I also watched, but different.
Our version of it was called Grange Hill, and we had another one called Biker Grove. And so like these two shows are just basically, Grange Hill's full of really kind of just rebellious kids that basically fuck the system and they hate their school, and it's just like a really shitty school. And then it's all about their behavioral problems and growing up. And then you've got Biker Grove, which is set in the northeast, at Newcastle. And so everything's just like circling the drain basically the whole time. And they're all just Gen X kids because like nobody wants to look after them, and they're all out on the streets all the time. And these are kids shows. These are for like 10-year-old kids. Insane.
Like it had many generations. Like I think it started as Degrassi Street when they were younger. The one that I got into was Degrassi Junior High. And like I was the same age as these kids, right? And it tackled so many issues. And like there were, you know, the punk kids, and there was a kid starting a band, and there was the nerdy kids, like all the different types of kids you would encounter in school, and they had their little cliques. But you know, one of the young girls gets pregnant at like 15 or 16, and she decides to keep the baby. And then, you know, one of the guys decides to experiment with drugs, and like, you know, one of them gets into drugs really heavily, and the other one kind of like decides he's going to jump off of a bridge. And then there's like another kid who's hitchhiking, and he gets, you know, molested as he's hitchhiking. So it tackled, and these were shows for 12, 13, 14-year-olds, but it tackled those issues that the average 12, 13, 14-year-old would have to tackle, right? They would get exposed to drugs and alcohol at a younger age. There would be the risk that you would get, you know, assaulted by someone, or that you would get pregnant. Like there was just all of that, and they did it in a way that was so realistic. Like one of the girls had strict parents, so she would hide clothes and makeup in her bag every day. So then she would leave the house in like really conservative clothes. She'd get to school, she would change into her like school clothes, and then before going home she would change again so her parents wouldn't know that what she was wearing at school. Like it was just like, and I went to a Catholic school, so I saw that all the time. Like girls would leave their homes with their kilts down past their knees, and then by the time they got to school they were rolling it up. So
yeah
like it was so well done and so realistic.
Yeah
Not like Saved by the Bell.
I know, right? And there's the other thing as well of like the sort of subcultures in America, in Boston and in California, and like it depends on where you live around Boston and where you live around California as to what kind of an effect that would have on you.
Yeah, because I mean, different parts of California are very, very different. Like I don't think my parents would have ended up in Malibu, so I wouldn't have.
Yeah.
I don't know where exactly in California, but, and I know like Boston does have a large Portuguese community, so I don't know where that is, but yeah, that would have been, it would have been interesting.
Well, because we got in the UK, the unifying thing we have between all the different parts of the UK is our class structure, and it's very, very fucking rigid. And when we're in South Wales, it's basically just industrialized working class. There's a lot of poverty around there. And particularly because in the Welsh valleys, the mines shut, and then so everybody was out of a job, and then so all these communities just died out up there, basically.
Oh, shitty.
Yeah, it's really bad. And we had to play rugby at school. We used to hate having to go to the valleys to play against the valley kids because they're all really rough and strong and tough and hard. And it was always terrifying. We're just these Wambley City kids.
Pussies.
Yeah, basically.
I mean, growing up where I did, it was just outside of Toronto. I mean, there were like bad neighborhoods, but like when you were in, and our schools were like, you know, you could have different kids from different neighborhoods going to that school. Like if you lived in a certain space, you kind of had the school zone and school system, but it wasn't a big enough area where they could really kind of segregate the schools to be like, oh, this is the posh kids school and this is like a poor kids school. Like everybody went to the same school, and you didn't really, like, it never really made, so there wasn't as much perhaps of a class system because we just didn't know, right? Like you didn't, if someone was in a different neighborhood or different area, it was just kind of like, that was, didn't matter. Like it just, they all just went to the same school. You were all there for the same purpose, and you hung out with who you hung out with, and that was that.
Yeah, it was, I didn't really notice it when I was in South Wales, because I spent some of my time in a local state school, some of my time in the convent school. Can't remember if I said it in another episode, but my grandmother paid for some of the school, well, most of the school fees. And then when she died, I had to go to the state school, back to state schools. And then when we moved to Portsmouth, and I got the assisted place there, that was when it became a really stark difference. I mean, first of all, I had a working class Welsh accent, and then that already puts a barrier up. But also, like, just financially, just the differences between my life and all these other kids' lives. Like, they'd have all of the fads and that, you know, like, I don't know if you had these things at school, but like the Diablos, you know, like they have like those two sticks and there's a string.
I've seen them.
Yeah, like just something like that. Like kids were obsessed with them, and then so everybody in the school had one for a while. Don't fucking know why. Everyone wanted to join the circus or something. And then it just puts barriers up because you can't mingle with that. Like you just can't, because there's one fad after another. Every term at school there's a new fad, and then you just can't possibly keep up. And even though you wear a school uniform, but then people would like, they'd like do things like get a coat. So there was like this brand called Musto, which are like sailing jackets. And then for some reason, all the rich kids liked wearing them for a while. They were like fucking 150 quid or 100 quid to get one. And it's like 12 and 13-year-olds wearing them. And I had my Metallica hoodie. And that was my coat in winter, was a Metallica hoodie over my school blazer.
I don't remember there being a lot of that. Like I do remember there being some fads, but not everybody jumped on board with them. Like there wasn't that pressure to get into it, and like different groups of kids had different fads. But like I don't remember it being like that as much. And then with my Catholic school, yeah, I don't remember that either. Like, and I guess we didn't have. There was not like, I don't remember there being a big class distinction between like, oh, those are the rich kids versus not. And that maybe they went to different schools and we were all just like solidly middle class. So there wasn't that big of a difference. But then like there was, I think it was like once a month they would do called Civvies Day where you could wear your regular clothes to school. And like, I do remember that being a time where people were like, oh, I have to go shopping for Civvies Day. And it's like, really? You don't clothes at home, like
he really got clothes.
Yeah, and like no one's seen them because they only happen once a month. But like, so I know some kids took that as an opportunity to like showcase not so much wealth, but they just wanted to showcase fashion. Yeah. Whereas, you know, I don't know, maybe I just lived in a bit of a bubble that I didn't feel I either didn't feel judged, get judged, or give a shit that I was judged.
Yeah, probably the latter.
Could have been any of that.
Well, because we also had, again, because when I was in junior school and infant school, everyone was just mates. That's just what you had. You had one or two bully kids, but everybody ignored them. But then when you were in secondary school, we had like this big division between the chavs, what we called them chavs, but the townies. But they were, because it's a private school, they're rich chavs. Chavs are like usually like, I don't have to say it without offending the internet. They're not top of the.
Have you seen The Outsiders?
No.
Oh, because they had greasers and socias. You have to watch The Outsiders. You have to watch The Outsiders.
Well, we had basically they called them the townies and the grungers.
Okay.
Right? But it's like, but then the townies were quite homogenous, but then the grungers weren't just grungers. Like most of us were just alternative kids. And then yeah, there was a couple of fights at school between them and stuff like that. It's like the 70s again with like the Mods and Rockers or something, but in like a really shitty.
No, like my school, like you kind of hung out, like the jocks hung out with the jocks, punks hung out with the punks, and like there was these groups, but there was no infighting between them really. And like and there were some people who could just kind of go between any different group, but there was never like if you showed up at a party and there were like the chavs were there, you weren't like rolling up my sleeves. Like, it was just like, oh.
No, we used to get like not in the same school, but the amount of times I got attacked when I was like between 15 and 19 just for walking down the street in a hoodie. Like I was walking through a park one day with some mates, and then there was some lads playing football. One of them came up in my blind spot. I didn't even know he was there, and he just punched me right on the side of the head. Yeah, just because I was wearing a hoodie. That would happen all the fucking time. Yeah, people just did that. And it's been like, oh, fucking grungers. That would be what they'd say. Fucking grungers. And then, and start fights with you. And it was always them starting the fights because you were the one that was different. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure, I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I never experienced that or observed that.
I just kind of think though that like if I'd grown up somewhere else and done something different or had an exposure to a certain kind of music at a different time or read a different book at a different time, then I might not be the person I am now. Like, would I
You definitely wouldn't be.
No. Like, how extreme would it be though? Would I no longer be pro-choice? Would I be pro-fucking life or something?
I wonder what Boston me would be like.
Well, there's like, you can kind of, if you kind of want to see the effect that people's rhetoric at you during certain kinds of your development, like it'd be quite easy to see that, because I mean we both grew up in Catholic schools and stuff, and they were clearly teaching us a lot of drivel. I mean, I remember I think I might have already told this story, but when I was like 15 and we had to do this essay at school about we had to do an essay about abortion, but they were making us do about the Christian perspective. And all of our lessons were always about the Christian perspective, never about anything else. So I refused to do it. So I just did like, rebel without a cause. I'm going to die on this hill. And I wrote an essay about how abortion should be allowed. And then my teacher lost my essay, and then I got an after-school detention.
Ours was different. I mean, I grew up in a Catholic school and we had religion classes every year, but it wasn't shoving it down our throats religion. It was just like, this is what our religion believes. Right? It was a Catholic school. But then I think one of the years it was world religions. So they taught us about like we'd have different chapters of different religions. So we would get exposed to different things. So it was surprisingly progressive in that, like, yes, you're here. This is the religion you choose to. And like we had church services at school occasionally, but not on a regular basis. And we would do like the morning prayers and stuff. But that, they were still never spoke ill of abortion, or there was never any like homosexuality is a sin in school. Like there was never any of that. It was much more on the loving side of religion. And then world religion was like, let's talk about what Buddhists believe and let's talk about what Hindus believe. And so it was just very, was it's gonna, like comparing it almost to like an airport. You don't have to fly Delta, but we appreciate that you do, right? It was kind of those, like, they exposed us to stuff, which I thought was admirable. I mean, I still didn't believe it, and by the time I started going into a Catholic school, I had already kind of lost any belief in religion that I'd had. But it was still interesting to learn it, especially because they weren't forcing it down our throats.
We had to we got one lesson on other world religions each. So we had one lesson on Islam, one lesson on Judaism, etc., and the rest was Christianity for the rest of the 5 years. And then we had to do a GCSE in religious studies, but because it was a private school, they could choose a certain curriculum, because private schools in our country get a lot more leeway in what they put in their curriculum. And so when it comes to religious studies, if it was a state school, there'd be a bit more of a holistic education. But because it's private, they can pretty much just do Christianity and shove it down your throat, and you have to accept it. And then, when I was at the convent school as a little kid, and they're teaching you about original sin, and you're like 5 fucking years old, you don't have the cognitive ability to understand what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And then you just end up growing up thinking, oh, women are bad because I'm born with sin because of my mum, because of Eve.
Yeah, because she ate that damn apple.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was in a public school until the 4th grade. And I think I'm pretty sure, because I went through was baptized, first communion, confirmation. And I think my first communion happened before I moved to a Catholic school. So my parents had to kind of guide it through the church. So I had to go to like Sunday school to do those lessons at Sunday school. And then it was very much crammed down my throat to get to first communion. And then I had switched to a Catholic school, and then confirmation took place from there. So it was just kind of like the regular curriculum, but I never remember it being an indoctrination into religion. It was just kind of more like, this is what our religion believes.
We had to sing hymns at school assemblies. We had to say prayers during form tutor groups. So like every morning you had to do a prayer, and every night before you go home you had to pray. We had to go to mass, and then so we had like, for the big religious celebrations, always had mass. But if you weren't Christian, you didn't have to go. So if you were Sikh or Islam or whatever, you didn't have to go to their things. But if you were atheist or agnostic, you had to go, which is just
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, ours was the same. But we'd start off the morning with like the national anthem and then a prayer.
National anthem, that's so weird.
National anthem, a prayer, and then like announcements. And I don't remember. Yeah, like we had songs and stuff that they would sing in assemblies, but they weren't super Jesus-y. It was there was one that was actually, it kind of had a good tune, so we would be like singing along.
Vibe into it. No, we had so when I was I started off at like a grant maintained school, so it was a Christian school, but it was state run and all that stuff. But I was super Christian, so I had to do all that stuff there. Then I went to the convent school, and all the hymns were sung in Latin, and all the other stuff was done in Latin. So I had no idea what any of it was, and yet we had to sing these fucking hymns. And then after that, I went to a local state school again in the last year of junior school, and all the hymns are in fucking Welsh. Every single.
At a state school, you still had to sing?
Okay, so when I was at the convent school, because even though I was in South Wales, they were again outside the curriculum being private. So I didn't have to learn Welsh or anything, and they could do their own stuff. But then when I went to the local state school, Welsh is mandatory in Wales. And yeah, I forget, I think some of the hymns must have been in English, surely, but most of them were in Welsh. Some of my teachers could speak fluent Welsh. Yeah, and half the time I didn't know what was going on because all the kids had learnt Welsh all the way through. So, but when I got there, I was in the last year of junior school, about to go, to secondary school, and I didn't have a fucking clue what any of it was about.
Do you remember any of the hymns?
No.
I was going to make you sing us out.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think that the potential there is that we would have been probably quite, even though like the essence of who we are, like at the core, might have been the same, but a lot of the stuff built around it would either be corrupted or different or not quite the same.
Because I mean, I think like healthcare is a good example of this, right? Like what Americans have been fed to believe about Canadian healthcare is very different from what Canadians experience in healthcare. So you would just be getting those skewed perspectives on things. So if you were constantly being raised, like a lot of people are in the US about the whole abortion debate, then you'd like that would kind of filter in where it would potentially make you one of those anti-abortionists, or, you know, maybe there would be enough influence on the other side to keep the same sensibilities that I have now. I don't know. I'm very curious. I'm more curious actually to know what I would be like if my parents had stayed in Portugal than I am if they'd moved to the US or like that version of me is what intrigues me the most.
Yeah. Because that still could have been like quite nice and positive and everything as well. I just feel that where American, like their political culture is so antithetical to us. Not the people, not the everyday people, they're fine.
No, but Portugal is and where my parents grew up is a very Catholic country. So if I didn't have exposure to non-religious institutions and whatever, like, would I be more religious now? Would I have thought like, oh, I'm raised in this culture where everybody gets married and has kids? Would I have just kind of like squashed down my desire to be child free and like, all right, I'm just gonna suck it up and do whatever else? Like it just, the pressures would have been very different because of just not the status quo, but I think that I wouldn't have been exposed to other options. So it would have been feeling very othering than like, no, there is a normal other way to do things. So I think what it boils down to is that if we were raised in a different place at a different time, we would absolutely be different people.
Yeah. But we don't really know how far that will extend though. Is it, we would be different, that's unequivocal, but we don't, depending on the environment and all that stuff, how different would it be?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we would be equally contented just elsewhere.
Yeah.
That would be the best case scenario. Equally or more content. No, I don't want somebody else to be happier than that. Fuck that bitch. Bye. Fade to black.